My name is Asia Meadows. I am a proud graduate of the inaugural Arrupe class of 2017, as well as 2019 graduate of Loyola University Chicago. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today's discussion. I will give a quick overview of our time together, and I will do a brief introduction with our panelists. Then we'll have a research presentation with our issues arising from the financial aid process within colleges in the US, followed by a roundtable discussion with our practitioners from the Noble Network of Charter Schools, Arrupe College, and Loyola University Chicago. Finally, we'll have time for our audience Q&A. And if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A feature to submit them. They're somewhere around here. Excuse me. First up, we have Bridgette Davis. Bridgette Davis is a doctoral candidate at the Crown Family School of Social Work and a social work and policy practice at the University of Chicago, as well as two-time Point Foundation Scholar at an Institute of Education Sciences and Pretorial Fellow. This fall, she will begin the next phase of her career as an assistant professor at University of Massachusetts at Amherst School of Public Policy. Her fields of interest include an anti-poverty policy and implementation, nonprofit organization, social equality, and administrative burdens. Her current project investigates the role of organizational policies and practice in reproducing or challenging the racial and economic inequality among youth as they navigate the transition to adulthood. Prior to her graduate studies, Bridgette worked on her 11 years in public schools and nonprofits in Atlanta and Chicago, teaching, coaching teachers, managing instructional outcomes, and serving as a dean of college access and persistence. We have Christina Robinson, is an alumni success coach for Noble Network for Charter Schools in Chicago and a licensed professional counselor for the state of Illinois. Born and raised on the south side of Chicago, she has unwavering commitment to serve Chicago young adults. She also serves on the board of directors for iGlow Mentoring, a Chicago mentoring organization for developing young leaders. In her private practice, she specializes in working with BIPOC young adults, women dealing with past trauma, depression, and anxiety. From alumni counseling to private sessions, she has witnessed the importance of addressing the total person in order for them to achieve their goals. Viviana Arellano is a Associate Director for Financial Aid at Arrupe College. Viviana was born and raised in the south side of Chicago, Illinois. She received her BA and MED from Loyola University Chicago. Viviana was a work study student in the financial aid office at Harold Washington College. It was there that Viviana knew she wanted to assist BIPOC students in funding their college dreams. And then last but not least, we have our lovely Amber A. Flowers, who's an alumnus of Arrupe College and current undergraduate student pursuing a bachelor's degree in marketing at the Quinlan School of Business at Loyola Chicago. And now I will turn it over to Bridgette for a research presentation. We have to unmute.
All right. Thank you all so much for allowing me to be here to present today. And I'm so excited to be a part of this panel and hear the panel thoughts in response to my research and work today. And thank you, Asia, for the very kind introduction. So my talk today is gonna be based on my dissertation and work, which was 2 years of study following students. And I'll kind of start by telling you how I set that study up and where we go from there. But this is really about the cost of aid and the burdens of what makes an affordable education in higher ed. So, as this audience knows, I'm sure, and is incredibly, clearly motivates all of our work, is that for 40 years, we've really been pushing a problem of persistent college enrollment and completion gaps, right? Both by SES and by racial groups, both college enrollment and completion have continued to have huge gaps between kind of white upper middle class folks and everyone else. I myself am a first generation college graduate and grew up in a rural area. And this is something that I learned about right in college and have been thinking about. But while we've had a number of different efforts on this area, and while we've increased college enrollment amongst a number of marginalized groups across society, right, these gaps continue to persist. And in fact, they're worse than they were 40 years ago. And so it's something that, right, really troubles all of us and matters, right, not only for equity in society, but for long-term equity in terms of young adults becoming adults and being able to take care of their families and participate fully in society. We also know, and I'll just share, right, we know that then college enrollment and college completion also has a lot to do with things other than just economics, has to do with well-being, things like voter participation and power, all sorts of things that we care about. And, you know, the research base on this has been incredibly clear, and that there's been essentially like there are sorting mechanisms, right, that exist that both happen in terms of what schools people end up at, in terms of both post-secondary quality, the kind of institutional graduation rates that different folks have access to, and also the kinds of the ways that certain schools both lead to graduation and then outcomes beyond graduation in terms of peer groups, in terms of networks, in terms of job prospects, lifetime earnings, et cetera. And where a lot of the research has paid attention to this, right, has really focused on kind of two things, which is that sorting appears to be, right, a product, if you take it at value and what the college application process is like and what college completion takes, it appears to be a product of two things, right? Capital and choice. And those are both really kind of core economic concepts, but they get applied to education. And I think it's worth breaking down here, right, that what this then drives and has driven is an understanding of capital as human capital, right? Test scores, class rigor, GPA, et cetera, right? All the things that students would need to have to be prepared for college, right? And we've seen that research on those things has led to a ton of work in the actual field, right? K through 12 education and otherwise, and nonprofits, supporting students developing what we see and what the research has shown to be, right, these areas of capital, and many cases are considered capital deficits among low income, working class youth and youth of color. So there's that, it's been constructed one way, right? Human capital. The other way it's been constructed is social capital, right? Leadership, experiences with internships, exposure to college and college knowledge, the kinds of things that having a high SES parent or a parent who's gone to college would give you. So there's been, right, the social capital piece. And then there's this idea of cultural capital, navigating institutions of power and privilege and understanding how to do those. So there's this piece of capital. And then there's been this other part where the research has been driven, that's been about kind of college choice. And are students going to the colleges that are best for them, colleges that have really high institutional graduation rates or not? Are students matching and going to colleges that are appropriately rigorous for them? And so in this case, right, the research and practice have really actually aligned, because then, right, the emerging consensus for closing those gaps that I talked about in the beginning, as we've now watched over these 40 years, in the last 20 years, the emerging consensus has really been this proliferation of essentially nonprofits that are either based in schools or partnering with schools, that really help, right, support young people with kind of a college coaching or college counseling response. And these nonprofits vary from, like, you know, standalone small nonprofits working in rural Mississippi with, you know, one set of schools, to, you know, organizations that are all over the country, and have replicated. They also vary in terms of their kind of financial, the way they financially operate and the way they operate in terms of partnering with schools. Like Avid, right, actually contracts with public schools, and then therefore is getting, right, part of the per pupil funding that goes to low income public schools to support young people, and a high school is preparing people for college. So this kind of emerging consensus looks kind of different, but it's really pretty similar. It's the idea that young people need recent college graduates, typically, to support them with getting through, right, these issues of capital, right, building their college knowledge, building their GPA and their test scores, preparing for college, and then getting through kind of the hoops of the college admissions process. But so my question in my dissertation study was really like, given all of this and given my own experience as a practitioner inside of these organizations and outside them as an educator, despite all this effort, why does this problem persist? Why do students who have been a part of these interventions, whose parents and themselves are committed to going to college, who's built the GPA, built the test scores, right, get a coach, get the support, why does this problem still persist? Why are we still graduating young people at under 50%, rates? So, right, why is it a coin toss chance? So my study set out to say, what can students' experiences actually show us that we may have missed? So what I did is I followed 31 students from 3 South Side campuses of the Noble College Network, the Noble schools, as that were all enrolled in this kind of program. So, right, they'd been enrolled in a college prep school since 9th grade. They'd taken rigorous courses. They'd had internships and summer college experiences. They'd gone on college trips. They'd gotten college counseling. They had coaches. And I was really looking at kind of average students. And the reason for that, right, a B average student, is because, first of all, it's right around the bell curve for the average of African-American high school graduates anyway. That GPA average is a 2.69, and the students in the study were from a 2.3 to a 3.2. The second is because my hypothesis was actually that middle students experience something very different than kind of the most elite students that get merit-based scholarships. And the third is because actually the middle of the bell curve makes up the vast majority of students of any kind that go to college in this country. And so if we're going to figure out how to get more students to graduate with degrees who want to go to college, then we have to figure out what that means for the average achieving student. I'll just note right here, this idea of who wants to go to college is that right now in this country, and since 2006, about 92% of young people across the country say they want to go to college, and their parents expect them to do so. So we're really talking about something that is self-determined by most young people across this country. We're not talking about kind of implanting a goal or having a perspective that kind of anyone else thinks is there for them. Most young people want to go to college and expect to earn a college degree. So when I followed these 30 young students, this is kind of this protocol that you're looking at is what drove the study and what I showed students that I'd be studying. So the idea was to start with them right around high school graduation and follow them in the transition because I had an idea that potentially there's something happening at this institutional mark where you're going from high school to college and you're interacting and you're trying to navigate all of the different pieces, right? From everything from friends and family all the way to kind of the unexpected stressors that come to being financially independent, et cetera. And I was really open to any answer. I've watched a number of young people go through this transition before, and I actually just knew that like there's a lot we don't know about what students are experiencing, and I was open to answers all over the board. So over 2 years, I followed those students, completing over 7 interviews plus check-ins with each of those students at different key time points. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I learned today. So my findings were this. First, verification for need-based financial aid presents these administrative burdens that warp the intended policy. And then by intended policy, I mean intended policy for the Pell and state MAP grants. Second, these burdens and their costs cause class and racialized access to campus resources. And third, these patterns of inequity contribute to racialized transmission of cumulative disadvantage during a critical developmental time period. And I'll talk about exactly how I noticed those during the study. So first, I'm going to share some quotes from students, and I'm going to talk about a thing called kind of learning costs, and the way that these learning costs shaped and limited college decisions for students. So first, we have a student who, this is where verification comes up. I think it's important that we all know that any verification for need-based financial aid doesn't always just come from the federal government. It comes from any institution. They can do it in any single way that they want to at any single time in the process, anywhere from admissions, all the way through graduation from college. A student could be pulled for verification and for various reasons. And so we have Georgia here, who this is before making a college decision, as she's trying to learn what her financial aid options will be. And she says, yeah, I mean, it was worth it and it wasn't. And she is saying doing the verification process to get a Beloit award letter. So I thought it might be affordable because of my service and leadership, but it ended up not being at all. And I could have gotten things set up for myself at UIC, like I could have gotten into TRIO. So we see a case here where getting flagged for verification pre-award letter in order to get an award actually means students are delaying their choice in their colleges. And by the time that Georgia actually decided on going to UIC, the TRIO program was filled. Its 75 slots were full. So next, right, we have Alex, a very similar situation, but a little bit different because actually he gets into a school. It's his number one choice. He wanted to be in a small school. He goes through the whole process of financial aid verification, sending back forms, et cetera, getting forms from his mom's work. And then he says, but like, once I found out the cost, actually, we could have saved that money and we could have made the payments that would have needed to happen if I would have known in January. But I don't know until he doesn't find out finally what it's going to cost him out of pocket until April. So it's not that his family doesn't have the money. It's not about the money. It's about the timing in which he knew he could. So then he scrambled, reapplies to Roosevelt, stays at home to save the cost. So that's what happens, right? What I saw students say and heard them say about their decision making. But then there was a whole other set of things that students would say about what happened once they got onto campus. And this really had to do with being flagged for verification after decision for college. So I met with Courtney on campus in September, and I'm visiting with her, and she's going to show me her dorm. And she says, okay, but I'm going to warn you, it's like Inglewood up in here, Bridgette. I don't know how or why they do that, but we only have we only have window air conditioners, and we're far away from everything. And we is doing a lot of work there, right? Courtney's showing me and telling me that this is basically an all Black dorm. And it's an all Black dorm de facto. It's not an all Black dorm on purpose in order to build community, right? It's happened kind of de facto. And so I'm going to just share with you another couple of cases and kind of tell you how I peeled this out. So then there's, right, David, who's at another big, large state university, not the same one, and says, so will we all work in the cafeteria or on custodial staff? And well, we have fun, and I found my college mom, but I would have liked to work at the library or the rec center. I could have studied then, right? So David's working 20 plus hours a week. He's super highly valued in food service, though, on his campus. And again, we does a lot of work. He's talking about the students of color, right? Then we have this case from Ebony, right? She says, so my advisor enrolled me in just 12 credit hours. By the time I registered, all the Comp 1 classes were full. And I didn't need or want to take the remedial class. I was like, what do you mean remedial class? He said, well, that's what the advisor offered me because the Comp 1 classes were full, right? And so you look at all these cases, and in each of these cases, when I asked the student, well, why are we in this situation anyways, right? Or I went back to the first interview and went back to thinking about what's happening, or went back to the summer interview where I asked them about how paperwork was going and getting everything ready for college. It's that students were experiencing delays because of verification flagged after they made their enrollment deposit. So they decided where they're going to attend. The university flags them for verification. They have to go through a number of processes, including for Courtney, it meant refiling her taxes. Her parents had to file amended tax returns, even just to get to be able to register for courses. And by the time they're registering for courses, or by the time they're able to get to the portal to apply for a job on campus, or by the time they're able to secure a dorm, right, the advantageous and best resources on campus are already taken up. So there's another case, right, which is that you can be a student, be enrolled, be taking classes, and then you can get flagged for verification. And so here's some examples of what students told me about that. So Ray had a first semester. He had okay grades. He did all right. He was definitely going to have to retake a class that was difficult. But when I talked to him in December, Ray tells me that he hasn't registered yet and that there's some kind of problem with financial aid. But his mom was on furlough for work over the holiday, which happened every year. She worked for a construction company. So he says, you know, we're going to have to figure this out. So I'll have to go back. When I go back in January, I'm going to have the paperwork, but we're going to have to figure it out. And I'm going to have to go back in and do it. So it ends up taking him the first 10 days of the semester in January, his second semester in college, to get everything resolved with financial aid. By the time that happens, right, he's now at the end of the add drop period. He's missed all of those classes and he has to enroll in a class. And he tells me, like, I end up not only being in an 8 a.m. physics class, but it's taught by a Russian speaking professor who has terrible reviews on Rate My Professor, right? Ray knows to look, but he says, but I can't have a choice. That was the only opening there was. And it's infuriating. He ends up failing that class and retaking it over the summer, right? And paying to retake it. I'll just have us know, right? And then here's like the most heartbreaking case. Bertha was again at another state university. Bertha had a great first semester. She was like in a dance team. Things were going well on campus. When I visited her there, everything was going well. But she was in this situation where there had been flags on her financial aid from the very beginning, but they allowed her to enroll in classes. She was starting, and her mom had been making payments all the way since the summer when she first made her deposit, because her mom knew that she made more money in the summer. She was a union construction worker. She made more money in the summer than she would in the winter. So she wanted to make sure she was starting to make her payments ahead of time. So she started making the payments. And when I visited Bertha on campus and I asked her about paperwork in September, she said, you know, this weird thing has happened. And I was like, what? Tell me about it. She's like, well, I had this flag on my account. I go to the financial aid office and the line is like so long. She's like, I mean, it's like so long, Bridgette. There's hundreds of students standing out there and I'm standing in line and I'm trying to get it resolved. And this woman from financial aid comes out and she starts waving her arms around and she says, like, listen, if you're here because there's something on your account, it's because the Pell Grant hasn't come through yet. Once the Pell Grant comes through on your account, then that flag will be gone. If in a couple of weeks that's not resolved, then come back. So Bertha said, so I left just like everybody else did. We all left. 2 weeks later, the flag's still on my account. So I go back, same long lines, same lady comes out and she says, okay, it's the MAP grant hasn't come through yet. Like the Illinois hasn't paid the bill yet. So like it hasn't come through yet. But so again, like wait a couple weeks. If it hasn't come through, then it's fine, right? Bertha gets caught up in classes. She's busy. She's doing things. Her mom's still making payments. Everything she thinks proceeding apace, going along. We get to December and I ask her if she's registered for her classes. She tells me she hasn't registered for classes, but she thinks it's just because her mom hasn't paid the December payment. And with the holidays, like she may be just behind. So she thinks I'll be able to register. It's not going to be a big deal. When I get home to Chicago, I'll handle it. I talked to her in January, and then she tells me that actually she, with an advisor from campus that was a trusted person, a trusted adult on campus, she said, come down here and we'll handle it, because they weren't able to handle it over the phone. So she and her mom drove all the way down to campus at Southern Illinois. They met with the financial aid office with this trusted academic advisor. And it turns out that not only had Bertha that flag that she had been basically told to ignore twice, right, was actually something else. And it was actually a requirement that she turn in a different form to break up the discrepancy about the dependent that had changed since her mom had filed the FAFSA originally, and the taxes that she filed for those. That was actually because Bertha's brother had actually, her brother had been killed while she was in high school. So between the time of that tax filing, right, and then what had happened, the dependents in the family had changed. That discrepancy had gotten flagged as a problem for her FAFSA, although it would not have changed anything about the income because it was fewer dependents actually. But that discrepancy required a form and an attestation of her brother's death. She ended up not only not being able to register for the next semester, but actually owing what the MAP and Pell would have paid. They would not let her retroactively take care of those. So that Bertha leaves college, can't enroll anywhere else, and now has essentially $17,000 worth of debt in money that was entitled to her from that one semester, right? So I'll just share a little bit about what that is meant, right? The Pell Grant is ultimately, right, from listening to students, what I started to realize is that this is all about timing. And college enrollment and financial aid, right, are used by a number of students, and the Pell Grant itself is the second most used means-tested poverty program or social mobility program in the country for 19 to 26-year-olds. Only Medicaid has moved more. And we typically don't think about the Pell Grant or state MAP grants in that way. And a lot of our attention, as I noted at the beginning, right, has really been paid in thinking about inequities to the front end of the college admissions process, right? To the part that's about merit and the part that is about being good enough and getting into the right colleges. But what I'm actually showing is that when you think about from the point from admissions, right, which happens December, usually through March right, it's happening right now, and students start trying to make college decisions. As soon as people get letters, we know how in higher income families, this is a market-based process as soon as you have admissions done, right? So what was merit-based in admissions becomes market-based in enrollment. And essentially, right, if you can pay immediately and you have the capacity to go, you're not actually subject to these forms because you're not applying to need-based aid, you don't go through the verification process. So you essentially can pay your enrollment deposit, go to orientation, get registered for classes, get advantageous majors, pick the best dorm that feels like an apartment, et cetera. And that's really what my study kind of shows. So I want to just tell kind of where this fits, because I think one thing that a lot of us in this work have heard of summer melt, right? And summer melt has been something that, right, the coaches in my study were incredibly successful. Every single student in the study avoided summer melt. I didn't have one student who wanted to matriculate to college who didn't matriculate to college in the study. But that's a 0-1 variable, right? You matriculate or you don't. What my study shows is that actually these other conditions that the outcomes may actually be worse than not matriculating, right? Which is that first, you may actually get delayed decisions and may shift your decisions. You may actually not get access to certain schools in which you were admitted to because you don't get the financial aid award you need in a timely fashion. The second is that if you get flagged for verification over the summer, right, it can delay your matriculation, or after admission decisions, it can delay your matriculation and then cause unequal access, right? Stratification within campus, which we know Pell Grant recipients are 10% less likely to graduate than their higher income peers on the same campuses, right? And that's regardless of institution. On average, that's a 10% difference. So that may make up some of this. And then after enrollment, right, we get these delays in registration, and ultimately this way that we get, right, time to degree is affected, debts can be increased, all right from this process of managing the compliance of financial aid. I'll just note there were students in the study who did get selected and complied with financial aid. The only ways that happened, though, were where there was one guardian and one W-2, and they also had either their college coach or a financial aid worker specifically help them through that process. No student navigated this completely on their own, and no student whose parent had a complicated financial situation, right? Like working multiple jobs, working in the gig economy, or receiving any federal grant programs of their own, right? SSI or TANF or anything else, anything that made their income more complicated, and students were not able to complete this to get through the process without a coach or financial aid. So in closing, I'll just share, right? I think what I'm describing to anyone who does this work is very clear, right? Reality is the policy is the problem, and the policy is constructed. And so we actually could, any of us doing this work, be a part of actually providing the data to help change the policy versus just shepherd students through this one by one, coach by coach in this very particular way. I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer more questions, and I'm excited to engage with the panel. Thank you so much.
Bridgette, thank you very much. I don't think we've met yet. I'm Father Steve Katsouros. I'm the founding dean of Arrupe College at Arrupe in Chicago for 6 years. And now I'm in New York with the Come to Believe Foundation and Network. I'm so pleased to be in this panel, particularly with my former student, Amber Flowers. So Bridgette, your work brings me back to some hard memories at Arrupe. You know, I mean, yeah. Talk about a burden. And it's funny, yesterday, I was talking to a friend of mine, I'm a Jesuit priest. I was talking to another Jesuit who teaches at a primarily white institution, Jesuit University. He's been there for 29 years in the business school. He teaches statistics and marketing. He's never heard of verification.
Mm.
So when you talk about racialized access, that really resonated with me, because for him, and he's a real lights on guy. I mean, he's, follows his students and he does their weddings and he accompanies them and he's great, but he doesn't know about this. I didn't know about this until I worked at Arrupe, when we had 350 students and over 100 of them were going through the verification process. We're going to hear from Viviana Arellano, our financial aid officer at Arrupe, and she was really the hero of this in terms of walking students through this, but also other faculty, staff members, deans, people who had no idea what they were doing in terms of the verification process, really trying to scramble to work with students here. So I guess for my fellow panelists, and it's great to have Christina Robertson here also from Noble. Bridgette's experience, obviously, in her research really aligned with my experience in Chicago at Arrupe College. How about with you? What was your experience either going through this as a student or helping other students, through the financial aid process, and particularly verifications? So this is open for anyone who has lived through what Bridgette has researched and presented so adeptly for us.
I can go. Thank you for having me. I'll just share my process when I was in college was not as strenuous as the alumni that I work with now, just be honest about that. But what I've seen has been very exhausting. And what makes it exhausting that every school has a different way of how they handle verification. And so having to navigate that, having to find out where is the student at in the process of verification, what do they need or what don't they need? Can they register for classes, or do they need to hold off, or will these classes be dropped if we don't get the paperwork in by a certain time? So it's just, there's no consistent way, and trying to navigate this system can be exhausting for me as an adult that's been through college, have my master's, and to have to navigate a student through that that's fresh out of high school graduation, excited about getting ready to begin, can be exhausting. And for the parent, it could be a lot as well too, to having to, okay, I need to find this paperwork, or I need to get a letter from an old counselor, and maybe that counselor is not there anymore, because again, every school has different requirements of what qualifies as the correct verification. And just knowing too, like our parents, for our students, they may not have that information available, or they may not have this perfectly filed system with all their tax documents, and just being honest. And so having to wait to gather that information and finding creative ways to get that information, I think what I've seen for me and for the students and parents as well, sometimes it can be very discouraging, where it's like, okay, maybe I don't make a lot of money anyway, but now I have to prove to you that I don't make as much money. Now I have to get all these documents. And so it can be discouraging, making you think like, is college really for me? Although they want to be there, the process can be challenging at times.
Thank you for that, Christina. Yeah, the frustration, and in some ways it's a confirmation that I don't belong. So Viviana, you're on the front lines of this. What's been your experience working with students on this with this?
I completely agree. It is very stressful for the students and as well as for the families. Arrupe, for example, as you know, Father Katsouros, is all hands on deck. So we have myself, we have the deans, we have the faculty, we have staff. That's hands on deck, that we start contacting students. We call, we send them emails just to make sure that all the verification items are taken care of before enrollment in the summer.
Thank you, Viviana. Amber, how about your perspective as a student either at Arrupe or going on for your bachelor's now at Loyola? What's your experience of this?
I've experienced all of this, including with my mom. So my mom I'm her dependent on my FAFSA information. So every year in the fall, my mom and we've gotten accustomed to making sure that we have all the 1090 paperwork and making sure that I can get those funds released. And it is kind of frustrating most of the time, because like sometimes it can catch you in the middle of the semester semester. And if you don't, and there's a due date to it. So if you don't get it in within that due date, then you'll have to like write an appeal. And there's a lot to go through that process. So I definitely have experienced that. I could say that like a recommendation as far as like for students and like high school students, I have I have a few cousins who are actually getting ready to go to college, and they have put like college as like second on their list after high school, simply because of like the stress of the verification processes and FAFSA and just trying to get accepted into schools and receiving the funding that they need. So I understand the stress of it all.
Amber, thank you for sharing that. So Bridgette, before we go into our kind of roundtable, Amber's made some recommendations. So what are the implications of all of this from your perspective, the implications of your findings for higher ed institutions in some?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, so I'll just answer, there's a quick question that I think is important to answer along with this that's in the chat, which is every level or the Department of Education. So there's actually something really interesting. So right, the Department of Education does actually flag FAFSAs for verification. They are not doing that this year, though. It's on pause, according to the Biden administration, because of the pandemic and because of how much flux has been experienced in people's income, just writ large across the country, that they are acknowledging that if their flagging system existed in the same way, it would flag so many students, it would overburden colleges. So I think so it does exist, but it's on pause. There's two things you should know about this, though. First is, because it does exist at a federal level, and it has existed for years as a federal level, it actually, those burdens of verifying get passed down to the institutions, and the institutions that bear the most burden of verifying are the institutions that serve the most low-income students. And so financial aid offices, are stuck doing this because they're afraid that they will get in trouble if they're trying to administer dollars that are not actually verified, So that's, I think, first. But the second is that it's on pause and institutions are still verifying. So it is not just the federal policy, Institutions have a reason to verify on their own. And we could talk about maybe what the incentive structures would be for doing that and why. But institutions all get to verify in any way they choose. And so some institutions flag every single student who gets need-based aid for verification. Some institutions just randomly draw. Some look for kind of discrepancies. Those discrepancies, like I said, could be based on the numbers of dependents, could be based on kind of odd income patterns, et cetera. But the reality is, for 90% of students, after verification, the aid qualifications don't change. So I would just say my biggest recommendations, I think, are twofold. I think one, there's been a lot of advocacy by folks who've looked at the lack of kind of Pell Grant take-up, which is Sue Donarsky and Judith Scott Clayton, saying actually, we don't need to do FAFSA. The IRS has the information that they need about your income and whether you actually qualify for need-based aid. We could just send a letter to every low-income family in the country that qualifies when their students are 17 that says, you qualify for X amount of need-based aid, and there's no real reason to do FAFSA or verify it all. So I think one is we could just eliminate those burdens entirely and just use tax data to help support that. I think the second recommendation is institutions need to understand that this is an undue burden on low-income students, and they need to acknowledge the ways that they are complicit essentially in opportunity hoarding that happens by upper middle class and white families in terms of getting these resources locked in by February or March, while low-income students kind of straggle along in this process. And I think while, right now, everybody's kind of fine with that conversation, looking like letting low-income and youth of color students show up to campus and saying that they're choosing less advantageous or less lucrative majors. They're choosing classes poorly. They don't know who to talk to at college. And it's actually those are empirical questions, because my research would say they're getting sorted into the worst experience on campus. So that's what I would say for institutions. And then I think for nonprofits doing this work, any advocates or nonprofits, the reality is I think we need to admit how much of our work is actually doing this. We're doing this, how much coaching Christina doesn't actually get to do because she's working with financial aid verification so much of the time. like all the other conversations she doesn't get to have, right? So I think nonprofits need to kind of own that. And I think they could do a ton by actually measuring this as a goal destructive piece of their data. Like, are students flagged for compliance? When are they flagged for compliance, and do they get through it or not successfully at different institutions, and what effect does it have? Because I think we have to advocate for policy change, and to do so, we know we have to have stories and data to do so. So I think that's what nonprofits could be doing. So I think those are my recommendations kind of for those different levels.
Thanks very much for that, Bridgette. And you've provided us with a segue to Christina. Christina, when I first moved to Chicago, I was told I have to go to Noble. I have to recruit students from Noble. And Bridgette considers, what you do as the Cadillac model of alumni support. So, walk us through that support. What kind of support do you provide students as an alumni success coach? What does your role consist of, and how does the process of matriculation unfold over time? And what areas of guidance and support are most commonly needed?
Yes, okay, I'll try to cover as much as I can in this amount of time. But really, my role is to support our alumni. I look at it as my role is to be a bridge for our alumni from between the college and them, and like getting them over, like, so they can fully be supported. So really, I'm working with underrepresented students, and my objective is to get them to and through college, because we can get them there, but actually getting them through the process. And so understanding that, just being honest, higher institutions weren't created with the students that we serve in mind. And so really helping them navigate the process. So that in between, from graduating from high school to actually getting on campus, that will involve me helping them with financial aid, enrollment deposits, housing deposits, making sure they're enrolled in orientation and selecting the right classes, using Rate My Professor, right? Financial aid verification, connecting them with key departments, on campus. All of that impacts them matriculating to college, but the actual staying there part is learning course selection, advocating for themselves, talking to their professors, helping them with understanding their award letters, or if something has changed where they get tons of emails with, how to pay attention to certain key emails, how to respond to them, how to, understand deadlines, while also trying to navigate time management of classes. Now you have all this free time, and you have 3 hours in between a class, and you could take a nap or do a TikTok, but you should be studying, right? So really helping them like with time management, understanding campus culture too is important. How do you find your people? How do you connect so that you really you have a sense of belonging? So really navigating the whole college experience, that's my role. It's in the title, a success coach, helping them be successful, and knowing that success is not necessarily a GPA, but really the entire college experience.
Thank you very much for that, Christina. I want to shift now to Viviana. So Viviana, we know that Arrupe College's financial model is based on students receiving federal and state aid. So the financial aid office is critical for Arrupe. So tell me about your role. When and how do you support Arrupe students with their financial aid needs? And what are the challenges that you see most frequently when you interact with Arrupe students?
Sure. So I began helping or assisting students as soon as they're admitted to Arrupe College. So as soon as they submit their applications and they're admitted, I immediately introduce myself. Isabel, who is the admissions director, immediately starts sending these students financial aid appointments. So that way we speak to the family one-on-one, what the expectations are, what financial aid look like, and if there's any scholarships available to the students. So Arrupe is a lot different than any other college or university. We really are hands-on with our students. So we are with the students for the first 2 years, and it is a lot of hand holding, but I think that's best for students especially the students we're serving. So we work really closely with the parents. If we see that something is wrong with their verification, we immediately, or specifically me, immediately starts contacting the student's advisor, their faculty. We create a team to make sure that we are able to handle verification issues. And for some reason, if verification is truly becoming a struggle for the student or the family financially, that's where Arrupe steps in and creates the bridge with financial aid hardship. So we have our own pocket of money that if the student cannot work with the Department of Ed, we step in and say, okay, well, we can cover you for the next 2 years if that's the case. So we are different, and we do have that space where we can assist students if we need to. I work with students closely, so I make sure to monitor their financial aid if they need verification. We do have a third party who handles our verification, but I work very closely with the students, and I will assist them in creating their accounts and submitting their paperwork. If they need to submit their FAFSA parent signatures, because a lot of our students their parents are undocumented, I will assist them in those cases. So I am very hands-on with my students. I make sure that we create some kind of plan to make sure that this does not become it does not hinder their enrollment or their housing or their any kind of work study funds.
Viviana, thank you very much for presenting the experience at Arrupe. So Amber, Arrupe grad, Loyola student, soon to be a Loyola grad. So from your perspective, again, how could the financial aid system be improved? Like, how could the FAFSA process be easier for you and for your classmates to navigate? How could schools better support students during that process? So your experience.
So I have like 3 points that I kind of came up with. Well, one was something Loyola started doing recently, or something that I found out recently as I made my transition over to Quinlan, was that there's a documentation portal where we can submit documentation if we can't make it to the office or something, or if there's like a lot of documentation. At one point I had to submit 100 pages worth of information and I wasn't going to carry a book to the financial aid office. So I'm kind of glad that I'm starting to see like it's trickling slowly, but like some schools are trying to like include documentation portals. And I think that's also convenient because you can also now like accept papers through like the IRS through like mail or email, and so that way like the process could be done faster, because like Bridgette said, it's about timing for sure. I guess another point that I would make would also be acknowledging what students are eligible for. And because like a lot of times we as students, like we see, okay, well, we owe the university, like there isn't like, I guess from like maybe a scholarship office or something that shows students like, yeah, this program at the beginning of the fall semester, it would be simple for us to see like, yes, these are programs that you could be a part of as a community in the school, but also they have scholarship programs attached to them, like more resources that we could be aware of so we can enrich our experience as well as enrich our financial journey. And and also with that being said, creating a financial journey. So I remember at Arrupe, we used to have like financial aid nights. I think that creating that financial journey also implies like, what do we have to be able to afford once we get to college? What do we have to be able to afford once after everything is paid for, as far as like Pell Grant, MAP grants, after all the loans have been distributed? Can we afford to even buy deodorant like on campus? Like, how does that look? Like, do we need to be able to afford a job on campus? Do we have to apply for work study? Should we apply to something off campus? Something that, because I'm personally, after I left Arrupe, I had to become more financial independent and like support myself so I can be more closer to campus, so I can make things more accessible and kind of easier for myself.
Amber, thanks for sharing that experience. Now, you know, we could go on. I'm very aware that there are some pertinent questions in the chat. And so I'd like to turn this over to my colleague here, Sam Adams, to lead us through those questions. And maybe we can have a summary statement depending on the timing after we get through these questions. So Sam, can you take it from here?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you for that discussion. I really enjoyed hearing from all the different perspectives. So I think, and Bridgette, I interviewed you last week that we'll publish this along with the recording of the panel, and this came up in terms of thinking about broader institutional change. So this question that Jeffrey Wright's put in the chat: would it be cheaper and faster to hire lobbyists and work with the government to change policy, or to fund nonprofits to focus solely on working with low-income students to manage through this process? So I think, when we've spoken, you've shared this idea of nonprofits may want to broaden their scope and take a more policy focus instead of just a student-centered focus. So talk us through this tension between these two avenues.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as a practitioner and as given the kind of, I think, all of this is happening against the context of kind of other institutions that support the transition to adulthood being eroded, right? We no longer have, union jobs available straight out of high school, or even jobs where you have the same shift and work with the same people every day for the whole week. We just don't have those kinds of things. So I think I would never, ever advocate that we reduce one-on-one support and human support for young people during this transition. Like, I wouldn't say coaching is a bad thing, let's get rid of it. But I think that the tension that Jeffrey's aligning, and that I think is real, is that, like, there are other things that we could be supporting underrepresented students with that could matter a ton for things like wealth building and getting really great grades and getting, internships and opportunities that actually put folks on an equal footing, not dealing with these kind of bureaucratic burdens. So I do think it is an area where we need policy change. But I think we won't get there if nonprofits and the folks that are in mission-driven orgs aren't real about how much of this work we're doing and how little of the other kind of work that donors and the narrative say we're, if what we think coaching is, if people in this country think that what coaching is actually building human capital in young people, but what it really is getting through these burdens, right? If we don't kind of uncover that, then we're going to be in this situation for a long time. And frankly, like right now, the incentives for nonprofits are to continue to show impact against those students who aren't in coaching programs, right? They're like, so for any of these, anybody is able to say, well, we get through 50% of our students graduate from college, and because we provide them with coaching. Meanwhile, regular CPS students without coaches only graduate at 30%, right? Like that kind of impact kind of way of thinking is really, it disincentivizes these bigger policy changes. And so I think that's huge. The other piece I'll just say is, I think if we branch out and we think really big picture about this, bureaucratic problems with entitlement policies that are meant to build a more equitable society also really teach young people that are disadvantaged in this country, like, not to be invested in institutions, not only institutions of higher ed, but broadly. Like, government does not want me to have an equal chance. And what that does, whether we're talking about rural populations or urban populations, is like, it really tells young people, like, you've got to go this alone, and you're better off going it alone. And so I think, like, this has some big implications for democracy writ large, I think, and participatory democracy, if we do not, and social equity, if we do not think about it as a policy change issue versus just one by one ushering students through.
I think another, in leading up to this, Bridgette, one of the themes that you really wanted to touch on was stratification. And so I think that you talked about sorting between schools, the way that these delays prevent students from attending maybe the school that they want to go to, and then sorting within schools, which dorms you get, which classes you get. And so I'd like to open the discussion up to anybody just to share your thoughts. So, for example, I was reading a recent research paper by Zach Bleemer, who found that students who, we have these GPA criteria for, like, business schools, for example, in a university. And even though those GPA controls aren't very good predictors of your eventual success in those programs, they prevent students that would most benefit from those programs from accessing them. So I think that's another example. It's not directly tied to verification, but it's another example of stratification. So I'll open it up to any of the other panelists. Where do you see stratification, and where could it be improved?
Sam, just to clarify, you're just saying broadly, where do we see inequities playing out in terms of access to campus resources and access to the good things on campus? Is that what you're meaning?
Precisely.
So where do we see either students by race or by class be kind of funneled away from certain opportunities on campus?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
I think Bridgette touched on it earlier, but I know where I see it is with the type of jobs that my alumni get. I think about the students that have jobs on campus where they're behind the desk, where they can still study and work versus having to work in the lunchroom or somewhere else. Also, when it comes to maybe resources, the time that the financial aid office is open, where they're working and going to class all day, and there's not after hours availability for them because they have to work. But I also see, like Bridgette talked about earlier, with the type of dorms, right? The dorms that are available, where the dorms, the not so nice dorms, but those are the ones that were available based on who got all their information in at a certain time. Those dorms tend to be further away. And I think about certain campuses that are really large. Who wants to walk, you know, for a 9 a.m. class when it's snowing and below 0 temperatures? And so things like that. So if they could provide maybe keeping a certain amount of jobs set to the side, or a certain amount of preferred campuses or dorm room set aside for those that are going through verification, because knowing that everyone doesn't have to go through that process. So why it's unfair to make those that do have to go through that process have to suffer with the less than admirable, resources that are available once they're done with it. So just putting something to the side for those that once they go through it, hey, we do have these classes available. You don't have to choose all 8 a.m. classes or 5 p.m. classes, but we have some set aside for those that finish the verification process if we're still going to go in that model.
I just want to build on what Christina said, something that really impacted me and some decision-making that my colleagues and I made at Arrupe, and really was the advent of Viviana joining our team. I was very aware that students who had financial aid questions, concerns, problems, issues were directed to a space on campus, not in our building, but in a very open area, in a lobby. And they were talking to financial aid counselors who were well-meaning, but there was no privacy. And, Amber's talking about a 100-page document, and it was very frustrating and very embarrassing for a lot of students to have to go through this. And it was also just not efficient to be in this space, and, it was sort of a drop-in sort of situation, very hit or miss. So, what we found, and our model, which was replicated at the University of St. Thomas, they also have a financial aid officer embedded at the college. It really makes a difference, particularly for students who, again, our budget's based on students receiving Pell Grants and state aid. So just that thoughtfulness and the efficiency, as well as the impact it has on the student and the student's experience of belonging and being on that campus, some sensitivity there.
All right, it is 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central. So we're going to stick to our allotted time together. As I mentioned, this is recorded. There'll be a video and an audio recording, as well as an interview that I did with Bridgette last week. So it will be able to share all of those resources. If you registered, you will receive it. Those will also be available at the CTB website. I'm just going to quickly share all the different organizations that are represented here today. So come to believe, CTB Network. Bridgette is a doctoral candidate, soon to be alumnus of the UChicago Crown School. Christina is an alumni success coach for Noble, and then Viviana is the financial aid director, and Amber is an alumna of Arrupe College. So you can check those websites out. Again, you can check the recording if you can't take notes this quickly. With that, Bridgette, thank you so much for your presentation. Christina, Viviana, Amber, thank you so much for your thoughtful discussion. Father Katsouros, thank you for your deft facilitation, and we'll see you all next time.
And also, let's just add that Amber will soon be a graduate of Loyola University Chicago as well. So bravo to my friend Amber. Thanks very much. This is a great conversation. Bridgette, your research is really important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.